Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I am going to be showing you how to make these super puffy organza, cute, flirty, fun dresses. I had quite a few requests for this. I decided to make one in white for all those DIY bridal girlies. This is the second time I've made this dress. I've now made it in white and purple. And I just think it's a super fun, flirty project. Personally, I prefer the shorter silhouette, but I did leave the white version a little bit longer just so you could see the difference between what that would look like. I also think these dresses look super cute belted. So let's get into the sew along. So this is what your pattern pieces will look like that you need to draft. But the good news is everything is just really wide rectangles. So this is a good point to pause the video and really look at these pattern pieces that we're going to be creating. You'll need to cut these pieces for the organza, and you'll also need to cut them for the lining. So you can cut these rectangles as wide as you want. The wider they are, the more gathered your project will be. So just make sure that they're significantly wider than your body. And that goes the same for the sleeve, and for the skirt portion, I'm going to be using about 5 yards of fabric. If this doesn't make sense yet, don't worry, just keep watching. Keep in mind that the length of the front and back pieces, as well as the skirt portion, will dictate how long your dress is going to be. And of course, as always, don't forget to add your seam allowance. In addition to fabric, you will also need to get some elastic for this project. I'll also be using some bias tape today, and we'll use that to create the channels of the elastic. So with all that in mind, it's time to cut out our pattern pieces, and to be honest, you guys, really I just eyeballed this. Since everything's gathered down, as long as the dress is too big, I can work with it. I can always make something smaller. It's harder to make something bigger. And you'll notice here, I didn't even draw out these pattern pieces. I cut my first piece and then I just used that as my guide for the next piece that I had to cut. And I do this for the sleeves as well. I'll be sure to include a link below on the fabric that I used. It was really affordable and it comes in a trillion different colors. I got 5 yards of this and I think it was like $2.99 a yard. And I have a little hack here for you today. Instead of cutting out that little shape for under the arm, the sleeve, on every single piece, I just cut my rectangular pieces, lined up all my edges, and cut them all out at one time. You'll see me do this here, and that helped ensure that everything was the same size. Now for the skirt, this is just really a super long rectangle. I used 5 yards, but instead of cutting one layer, I cut a very long piece on the fold. And since this is cut on the fold the way that I did this, it actually makes it really easy to finish the skirt because you don't even have to hem the bottom. After you cut out your organza pieces, you can go ahead and use those as a guide to cut out the lining. So you'll just need to cut lining pieces for the top and for the skirt of the dress. I'm just using 2 yards of a satin fabric here. Now I'm just going to use the remnants from the 2 yards that I bought for the satin, and I'm just going to use this piece as my skirt. Now the lining skirt does not need to be as gathered as the organza portion of the skirt, so that's why I'm just going to use this piece. You'll just want to be sure that the width of this lining skirt is not any shorter than the bodice of the dress once you sew the top front piece and top back piece together. So if that measures 60 inches, then you'll want to make sure that the width of this skirt is no shorter than 60 inches. And I'm also not going to cut this to the length that I want it right now. I'm going to do that as my very last step. Since this dress is white and the organza is super light, I need to make sure that my lining is not cut too short, or else lots of things will be visible. So now just to recap, we have 2 sleeve pieces and 2 pieces for the front and the back out of organza, as well as the skirt, which this will make a little bit more sense as we're sewing. I always recommend watching a DIY tutorial from start to finish before even trying, but this is 5 yards of organza. And here's a look at those lining pieces. All right, now it's time to get sewing. We're going to start with the sleeves, and we'll be using the bias tape to create channels for the elastic. And since the sleeves are unlined, this is a really important step because it keeps the elastic from being visible while you are wearing the dress. So here I'm just opening up the bias tape and pinning it to the top of the sleeve, and I'm also going to repeat that for the bottom of the sleeve. Now I'm going to sew that to the organza, and I'm just following the fold line of the bias tape. And then you repeat the same for the bottom piece of the bias tape. Then I'm going to fold the bias tape in half again, tucking that seam allowance inside of it. And using a very small seam allowance, we're going to sew this down, and that is the beginning of the channel for the elastic. And you'll also need to do this to the bias tape on the bottom of the sleeve. All right, this is the final fold for the bias tape channeling that we're making. You need to fold this bias tape that is attached to the organza one more time. And again, using a very small seam allowance, we're going to stitch this down to the organza. So now you should have a channel for the elastic on the top and the bottom of the sleeve, and my channels are quite small, so I'm just going to use a bobby pin to slip the elastic inside those channels. And each sleeve needs 2 pieces of elastic, one for the top, one for the bottom, and just measure a piece of elastic around your bicep, and it needs to be a little snug or else the sleeve won't stay up. And to make sure that I don't lose the edge of my elastic within the channeling, I'm just going to use a pin to keep it in place. Eventually, your elastic will make it to the other side. Make sure that nothing is twisted, and it's time to stitch the elastic down at both ends. And to do this, I just did a straight stitch back and forth, back stitched over the elastic a few times to make sure it was secure. And now you need to repeat all that for the second channel of elastic on the sleeve. You're so close to being done with your first sleeve. With both pieces of elastic inserted, we're now going to sew up the side seam of the sleeve, and we're going to do that using French seams. French seams are a really great way to conceal your raw edges when you're working with organza. For French seams, you first sew wrong sides together, trim the seam down, and then sew right sides together. I'll be sure to include a link to another tutorial. And again, we're working with wrong sides together for this first step. It's going to feel very wrong if you've never done it before. And now we need to take this over to our table and trim down this seam allowance to pretty much the smallest we can get it. So here you can see I'm cutting that seam allowance down really close to the seam that I just sewed, and I'm going to make sure that I trim any of my extra threads. Now we're going to turn the sleeve right sides together and sew a new seam that will enclose that raw edge. And finishing that French seam is the last step on the sleeve. So now you need to do all that over again for your second sleeve. Don't worry about the pins you see here. I was just using them to keep my sleeves flat so that you could see them a little bit better on camera. But all these steps will make the difference between a DIY dress and a dress that looks professional. So in the end, it's worth it. So with your sleeves set aside, it's time to start working on the front and back pieces, and we're going to use the bias tape once again. So I have my lining piece here, and I'm going to unfold my bias tape and pin that to the top on the wrong side of this lining piece. And here you can see I have the bias tape facing downward. And once you have that all pinned in place, you're going to lay your organza layer right on top, and you're going to pin that in place too. I tend to just pin the bias tape first because I think it holds things in place a little bit easier. These fabrics are kind of slippery. So now, following the fold of that bias tape, we're going to sew all 3 layers together. And yes, this will sandwich that piece of bias tape in between the lining and the organza. So now that we've sewn that seam, we can flip the organza to the right side of the fabric. Here's a closer look at that seam when the organza is flipped to the right side, and you have that seam and the bias tape sandwiched in between. So now it's time to take the edge of that bias tape and fold it to the inside of the lining, and you can go ahead and pin that down. Make sure you're tucking in that raw edge. The nice thing about bias tape is that it is pre-pressed, so it shouldn't be too difficult to tuck in that raw edge. But as you can see here, I am pressing as I'm going, and this is going to ultimately create the channel for the elastic on your front piece and your back piece, because you're going to repeat this step for your back piece as well. What I like about this method of sandwiching the bias tape in between the lining and the organza is it creates a really nice finished edge for the organza on the front of the dress. So now you can take that over to your machine and sew through all those layers of fabric. Just be sure that everything is laying nice and flat. You don't want to accidentally mess up your organza. And now it's time to insert your elastic into that channel. You only need 1 piece of elastic for the front and 1 piece of elastic for the back piece. So I just measured a piece of elastic that just went kind of a little bit shorter from armpit to armpit. These pieces of elastic have to be tight or else the dress will not stay up. So kind of a little bit in from armpit to armpit for my front piece and for my back piece. And again, I'm using the same method for what we did on the sleeve, making sure that I pin the end of the elastic onto the channeling so that we can get the elastic through. So after you've repeated that step for both your front and your back, it is time to sew up the side seams. So we're going to start by sewing up the side seams on just the lining. So here you can see I'm just carefully folding the top layer of organza out of the way. And I'm just gonna sew these up using my serger. I'm not gonna worry about a French seam here, but if you wanted it to be fancier, French seams definitely give a cleaner look. Once you've taken care of the side seams on the lining, it is time to work on the side seams for the organza. So for this step, I'm just going to use French seams. I prefer using French seams on the organza because I think it just neatly tucks away the raw edges and doesn't make any serger threads visible. And with those side seams complete, it is time to set in your sleeves. So again, you can use French seams, but for this seam, I'm just going to use my serger so you can see what it looks like. But we're just matching all 3 layers, the lining, the organza, and then the organza of the sleeve. Gonna line up that U shape with right sides together and attach both sleeves to each side. And with both sleeves set in, your work on the bodice is complete. So now it is time to work on the lining skirt and the organza skirt. But here's what that inside seam on the sleeve looks like with a serger. So the first step here is to sew up the side seam of your lining skirt. So again, the width of this piece of fabric matches the width of my top and back pieces when they are combined together. So this piece of fabric is about 60 inches wide. So here I'm just putting right sides together, and we're gonna sew up that first side seam for the skirt. If this piece of fabric is wider than your top bodice, then you can simply gather that down to match. And with right sides together, I'm just going to pin the lining skirt to the lining bodice. And I'm just going to match the side seam of the skirt with one of the side seams on the bodice. And again, we're just working with the lining, not the organza at this point. And again, I'm just using my serger to attach the lining pieces together. Hemming the lining on the skirt should be the very last step, but I knew that I had too much length and it was getting my way, so I did trim off quite a few inches. And now it is time to sew up the side seams on your organza skirt, again using a French seam. And with that side seam complete, it is time to sew the gathering stitch along the top of the organza skirt. So this is just a really long stitch, and remember, we don't back stitch our stitches when we're trying to sew gathers. And between the start and the end of this gathering stitch, you can leave about an inch gap. You don't want to sew the ends of this stitch shut. So now, using the end of one of our gathering stitches, we're going to use that loose end to pull the gathers onto the fabric. And here you can see I'm just gathering and gathering and gathering. I'm going to gather until the width of this skirt matches the width of my organza top. So again, I'm gathering about 5 yards of fabric down to 60 inches. And while you're doing this, just take your time. You do want to make sure that all your gathers are evenly distributed, because if they're not, you'll be able to tell when you're wearing the dress. To get more even gathers, you can actually sew 2 gathering lines, 2 basting lines parallel to each other, but for time's sake, I just did 1. And you're almost there with all your gathers evenly distributed. It is time to sew the organza skirt to the organza top. So here I'm just pinning. Again, you can use whatever method you like. Since this seam is visible, I am going to be using a French seam, but if you wanted to just sew it and use a serger, you can of course do that as well. It will just be more visible. And once you've attached your organza skirt, the last step is to hem your lining piece. You definitely want this to be about an inch shorter than the organza, and honestly, you can hem it whichever way you like. I actually didn't even really hem mine, I just serged the edge of mine. You can do a rolled hem, you could do a baby hem, you can do your standard turn inside and hem, truly whatever works for you. If you made it this far, congratulations, you should have a finished puffy organza dress at this point. This is definitely the longest sewing tutorial I have ever made, but I hope it helped shed some light on how I made these dresses and helped you create a dress that you dreamed of. So as always, if there's anything unclear, I'm available via comment, DM, message, email. Please send me your questions, and I'll see you next time.